Good afternoon and welcome to the Laurier Northern Webinar Series. For those of you who have not joined before, this is a monthly series of virtual webinars that highlights Laurier's multidisciplinary Northern research, which is conducted in close collaboration with Northern communities, institutions, and partners in the Northwest Territories and other Northern locations. For today's webinar, we have 4 speakers bringing you different perspectives and research on Northern water resources and climate change. And with all of the webinars, we do start with a land acknowledgement. So I acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University's Ontario campuses, situated on the Haldimand Tract, reside upon the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land holds significance as part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, symbolizing their commitment to sharing, safeguarding resources, and living in peace with each other. Today, this gathering place serves as a home to numerous First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous communities from across Turtle Island. Additionally, we extend our respectful acknowledgement of Laurier's research activities in the Northwest Territories. Laurier has established permanent infrastructure in Yellowknife on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Dene, Inuit, and Métis people of the Northwest Territories, as well as the traditional land of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation and Chief Dry Geese Territory. We further extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people of the North who call this territory home. We are grateful to the Indigenous people of the Northwest Territories for allowing us the privilege of learning, working, and residing on their lands. Additionally, we deeply appreciate the generous sharing of traditional knowledge, wisdom, and ways of knowing. To express our gratitude, we can engage in continuous learning, open dialogue, and thoughtful reflections about the rich histories, cultures, and contributions of Indigenous people. Through our ongoing learning efforts, we aim to foster understanding and build meaningful relationships with the Indigenous communities on whose land we live and work. Our first speaker today is Dr. David Rudolph, professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario. You can go ahead and share your screen, Dave.
Please let me know if that's good.
Yeah, we can see it and we can hear you well. Thanks.
Great. Okay, well, thanks very much, Lisa, and thanks everyone for attending today, wherever you are. I hope you're well. So briefly this afternoon, what I'd like to talk about is a part of the hydrologic cycle in the northern landscape that's probably changing the most rapidly, and that's groundwater. And this area, as a result of a warming climate, has definitely seen signs of major change hydrologically, as we've seen. And I want to share with you some ideas of why I think to me, it appears like it's awakening a giant, just the term I'm using for today. As we all well know, permafrost in the north varies significantly from the southern part of the northern landscape to the far north, from being relatively sporadic and discontinuous south of Yellowknife, if we look specifically at the Northwest Territories as an example, and then we propagate up towards the north, where it gets a little bit more discontinuous and finally becoming quite continuous and hundreds of meters thick as we get towards the Beaufort Sea up in Tuktoyaktuk and Inuvik. And the occurrence and continuity of permafrost significantly influences how groundwater moves, how it circulates, how it interacts with the ground surface. And that's what I really want to focus a little bit on today. And I'm going to take us to a site near Norman Wells within the discontinuous permafrost zone, just for some discussion and some examples. So the water balance on Earth is relatively well known. We've all seen this type of diagram, and frequently when we see it, we're a little bit startled by the magnitude at which groundwater represents a component of the hydrologic cycle here relative to other forms of fresh water, including all of our surface water. So it's such a significant amount. But carrying on from that, when you take those other sources of water into context, you can see that the ground ice and permafrost still represents probably 3 times the volume of all lakes, rivers, and swamps, marshes, wetlands combined. So part of the idea of being a giant here is there's quite a bit of stored entombed water that, as the thawing occurs and it's slowly released, has a significant effect. So we'll look at that in a little bit of detail here. So groundwater in the northern landscapes are used for a variety of reasons, the resource, and it's a little bit different, obviously, across Canada, how groundwater gets used. But it's significant drinking water source for lots of wildlife and, of course, humans. It's used in all kinds of different industries. And, of course, it sustains in a very important way surface water bodies like streams and lakes, and provides very significant, important nutrients to terrestrial surface in both the aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. But on top of that, as has been shown by many of my colleagues, as water tables fluctuate, and which influences soil moisture content, that is also controlling how wildfires behave and how they where they occur and their extent. And also the circulation of groundwater clearly is being observed to impact the rate at which permafrost is degrading. And also studies have shown that as the permafrost progressively thaws, it may be delivering solutes that have been previously entombed in the subsurface towards the ground surface. Now, this diagram is a little bit busy, but I borrowed this from Michelle Woolvord and Barrett Karelick's chapter on groundwater and permafrost, and I think it's really useful to take a look at. So the upper part of the cross-section shows a case where the permafrost is relatively continuous and very little interaction between the deep groundwater systems and the shallow groundwater systems. So most of the activity is moving in the shallow active zone there. And as warming occurs, and I've just included temperature data from Norman Wells over the last about 50 years, and you can see this warming trend in air temperature, and that type of warming appears to be accelerating the degradation of the permafrost. So in the panel below, then, we see these talus opening up, connections between the deep groundwater systems and the shallow groundwater systems, circulation enhancing. In some cases, lakes are disappearing as a result of a loss of water. Others are growing and forming as a result of increased circulation to them. And of course, as the permafrost degrades and thaws, it changes its volume, resulting in very irregular land deformation across the land surface, which impacts infrastructure, formation of lakes, and migratory routes for animals. But on top of that, that permafrost, which may have in it a whole variety of different solutes that could be mobilized, probably carbon's the one that comes to mind for most folks, then can be mobilized as it's thawing. So this sort of diagram gives us that kind of indication. And the challenge then is, how do we predict this and make sort of a quantitative assessment? Because the processes are relatively slow, we often use numerical models. So I just want to use an example of a case where here's an entombed contaminant source. And what I mean by that is this might be a landfill at a small community, which was placed on the ground surface, anticipating would be frozen in permafrost and be essentially immobile, starting to thaw. And what kind of impact might that have on a lake or a river? So this little simulation here shows you in the first top left panel, starting off with a relatively continuous permafrost thawing over time. It's hard to see the numbers there, but about 400 years into the simulations, which is a very simple simulation going from an average temperature of -2 in the air to a 3-degree increase to an average of 1 degree over a long period of time, results in this degradation of the permafrost, warming of the subsurface. And in the panel on the right shows this potential landfill finally being released and moving towards a discharge point, which is just a small stream. So even a simple simulation like this requires an awful lot of information to be able to inform the model, to be able to do realistic simulation. And so one of the best ways to do that, of course, is to go to a natural field site. And here's the location here that we've been working on between the towns of Norman Wells and Toledo. And this site was established with our colleagues, the Dene and Satu First Nations colleagues working in both communities have helped us design the research programs at this site and facilitate them over the years, and share a lot of traditional knowledge with us as we've been working along. And this site is then a watershed typical of the Central Mackenzie Valley. The purple line through the middle happens to be an all-season access road that was constructed during time of petroleum exploration. But information that one would need for even a simple model like I just showed you, you would need from doing some field experimentation. So if you're interested in hydrogeology, getting out to the field site, first of all, is extremely difficult. So access it restricts your activity and what you can actually do. That's nothing new to folks that'll be on the call. So the more conventional systems, drilling, installing monitoring wells, for instance, are essentially cost prohibitive for small research grants, or maybe not possible at all. And then mapping any type of groundwater flow phenomena the way we'd normally do is difficult. Mapping the continuity of the permafrost is extremely difficult. So that's a challenge we'll look at. So one approach that our students have taken on is to use remote sensing tools. And a couple I've got here, obviously orbit-based optical and other tools are helpful. And the ones I want to talk about specifically today in the time I've got is using infrared imagery from relatively low elevation helicopter surveys, and also airborne geophysics, both of which can be done on a regional scale. The first one is looking at infrared. So, of course, when infrared responds to temperature, so if you can track and observe different changes in contrasting water temperature, you may be able to detect groundwater springs and groundwater discharge points. So this was the focus of this particular study. So if there's a contrast between warm water and cold water, you can pick it up. So let me just see if my little video will work here. And what you're going to see is flying over top of that access road I showed you on that first diagram, and you'll see the infrared and the visual at the same time here. And we'll just fly along here and maybe turn off the sound. There we go. Hopefully that's not in your ear, but moving along here, you can see the infrared image below illustrates this contrast between warm, which is the yellow colors, and the darker colors are blue and purple. And as you go along here, you can hardly see the water in the visual image, but you can certainly see it. And there's an example of a very significant groundwater spring that we never would have seen visually. So flying over the area with the infrared camera helped us to isolate areas where groundwater was discharging, and it would help us focus our sampling programs. So the second technique I want to show you is an airborne geophysical technique, which is using a measurement of ground resistivity, and we're making the interpretation that the permafrost is highly resistive as opposed to thawed ground. And we're using a device that has multiple coils in it. So it's a frequency domain that actually measures at different depths through the profile, and you can combine that together to look at a three-dimensional image of the subsurface. And we flew this over about 1,000 kilometers. So back to our field site, here are the two blocks that we flew here, and I'm just showing you some examples of it. In the right-hand side at the top is about 10 meters below ground surface, the image that came from the airborne geophysics, and you can see places that are blue are conductive, and where they're sort of red and yellow are more resistive, and that kind of gives us a way of mapping the bottom of the permafrost face there. And then the next one down is much deeper, and it's getting into the bedrock, and you can see that dark blue area there represents a conductive target, which is likely conductive groundwater coming up through structural features in the bedrock. So this combined work, when you stack it up into a cross-section, now this is a couple of cross-sections through a few of the lakes, you can see where the geophysics allows us to map the continuity, three-dimensional continuity of the existing permafrost, and find talcs that are open in and around the lakes and associated with different features in the terrain. So the airborne geophysics certainly helps for that. So I'll finish off by just saying that as this warming process occurs, as groundwater starts to circulate more and more in the subsurface, this warming will release an awful lot of water, potentially release a lot of solutes that have been entombed and are now being circulated and moved back to the terrestrial surface. And of course, that groundwater is allowing heat to move around, circulate deep with shallow systems, change water chemistry, all of which is a massive change in the northern landscape. But I will say that additional temporal and spatial field monitoring is critical if we're going to use these predictive models to do a good job of tracking it. And I can't understate how valuable the traditional knowledge and the collaboration with our First Nations colleagues and guests and hosts, have been in part of this work. So I'll just finish off by a quick note to our research team, quite diverse, sponsored and hosted by the government, Northwest Territories, and the Environmental Science and Research Fund. We work directly with both the Sawtooth, Norman Wells, and Toledo Renewable Resources Boards and Councils, thankfully. Synovus Energy has been supporting us, and of course, worked through Wilfrid Laurier and the University of Ottawa working on the carbon work, and Global Water Futures supported a significant part of it. So, Lisa, I'll turn it back to you.
So our next speaker is Dr. Philip Marsh, Professor and Canada Research Chair, as well as the Director of both the Trail Valley Creek Research Watershed and the Arctic Hydrology Research Group at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. So go ahead, Phil, you can share your screen.
Okay, thanks very much, Lisa. Is that working okay?
Yes, it looks great, thanks.
Okay, great, thanks. And thanks, Lisa. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And thanks for that nice introduction, Dave, to some of the features we all learn about and work on across the North. So thanks a lot. So I want to talk today about a specific type of lake that occurs over large areas of the Arctic called thermokarst lakes, and talk about a feature of rapid lake drainage, and think about whether the rate of drainage has crossed a tipping point over the last few decades, and if so, why, and what we know about it, and how this might change into the future. Okay, sorry about that. So as we all know, there's vast numbers of lakes in the north, and especially north of 45 degrees. So we show on the left here a data set from McGill University called Hydro Lakes, just showing the vast numbers of lakes across Canada, Alaska, Siberia, and Scandinavia, for example. And on the right shows areas with exposed bedrock. So many of these lakes across the north are bedrock controlled. Here's just three examples from areas that I know across Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Yellowknife area. And these are lakes controlled by exposed bedrock. They're highly variable in size and shape, and they're typically long-term, very stable features. There's another type of lake that's very common across the Arctic that are controlled by permafrost and look and behave very differently. Where these lakes are, or where the permafrost, is ice-rich, we call these lakes thermokarst lakes. So we have two maps here of the Northern Hemisphere from a paper by Jones, the one on the left showing a map of ground ice extent from high to low ground ice, and the map on the right showing the thermokarst landscapes as defined by Jones in their paper. So you can see the huge areas of the Northern Hemisphere covered by these lakes. And they define thermokarst lakes as those that form as a result of subsidence of the land surface due to the melting of massive ground ice. And as you can see from the map on the right, the red, the cumulative area across the circumpolar region of thermokarst landscapes is huge, and cumulatively something like about the size of the Greenland ice sheet, for example. So these thermokarst lakes, as I said, are very different and look very different and behave very different than bedrock-controlled lakes. These are just three images randomly picked of areas I sort of know across the north as well. These lakes are typically smaller, but larger in numbers than the bedrock-controlled lakes. They're often elongated, and often, as this example from Alaska, they're oriented to the dominant wind direction. And these are typically extremely unstable over time due to permafrost thaw. These lakes, though, are very important to northern communities, to fishing, hunting, to migratory birds, to the hydrology, and we know that they're extremely sensitive to a change in climate. And I'd suggest that they're probably important to the regional climate as well, as they cover a large area. Within areas of thermokarst lakes, 10 to 50% of the area is covered by lakes. Lake ice cover remains for many weeks after the land is snow-free. And these lakes, of course, have a big impact on surface albedo and temperature, both in the winter and in the summer. So, paper by Jones et al. Gave great examples showing the unstable nature of these thermokarst lakes and how they've changed over millennia. The map on the left, or the diagram on the left, shows typical end of the glacial maximum landscape, lots of ice wedge polygons, ice wedges below the surface, and limited lake initiation. As we moved forward in time, it became warmer, there was widespread lake initiation and thermokarst processes. So lakes began to grow over time. And over the last 9,000 years or so, this landscape has continued to evolve with lake drainage events, secondary thermokarst lake development. So quite a dynamic landscape. So that's up until the recent past. So the big question is, what will happen to these lakes as the climate continues to warm into the future? So another diagram on the left by Jones looking at a warmer future and changes in increased drainage and reduced permafrost aggradation. So what we're interested in is how many of these lakes will exist into the future, and the vast number of changes in the environment that control the removal of these lakes from the landscape. So what do these lakes look like? Here's just a few examples. On the left, an example of pre and post drainage. From 1950 to 2000, the lake drained in 1989, carved a massive channel through very ice-rich permafrost. And then on the right, just examples of drained lakes across an area of the Western Canadian Arctic, and at the bottom, a pingo that formed over a few hundred years in a drained lake. So how have these lakes changed in the last 75 years? And what is the future? So I'll just show briefly and go through briefly a few examples of this. So this is an area in the Western Canadian Arctic between Nunavut and Tuktoyaktuk. So a bit further north along the Mackenzie from the site that Dave was explaining. And this is an area dominated by thermokarst lakes, almost 15,000 lakes covering 22% of the area. Great location for studying these features with multiple weather stations, remote sensing products, water survey discharge data as well. So we studied in this area the changes in lake drainage from 1950 to 2000 and published this in a paper in 2009. The first period, 1.1 lakes drainage events per year, which was similar to the estimate from J. Ross Mackay over the last few millennia. But then going into closer to the present, the rate of lake drainage decreased from 1 drainage event per year to 0.8 to 0.3. This is a period when the climate was warming, permafrost was warming, active layer was deeper, and it was certainly expected that lake drainage would decrease over this period of time, but as we showed, it decreased. In a paper we published in the Conversation, we suggested that as the climate continued to warm, that it would likely result in a change in the rate of lake drainage to rapid increases in lake drainage events. A recent MSc thesis by Dilshan Karishwaman looked at this similar study area to the last study from 1950 to 2019. He showed from 1950 to about 2004, this continued increase in drainage events, and then a sudden increase in drainage from 2005 to 2019. So the questions are why and what would be the short and long-term future of these lakes. We'll be making progress on understanding these processes, following J. Ross Mackay's work on catastrophic lake drainage, showing that ice wedge polygons were the key to understanding this, both needing to understand high lake levels and flow over and through ice wedge polygons and the melting of those things. So the next few slides will just show some of the ongoing work we're doing to try to understand these effects, from modeling of outflow hydrographs, where we showed we could model outlet flows from these lakes assuming that ground ice was extremely ice rich. And we tested a glacier dammed lake outburst model, which showed that it could quite easily predict these drainage events, but couldn't predict, of course, the start of drainage events. Then we started looking at some of the different controlling factors from lake levels. There's a paper by Stefan Pohl looking at lake levels over the last, from 1975 to 2006, and found no real changes in lake levels. So this suggests that changing in lakes and flooding through or over ice wedge polygons wasn't the controlling factor in these changes in lake drainage. We then went on and looked at winter snow cover. Here's snow survey results from 1991 to present, showing no big changes in snow accumulation, but certainly more variability over the last 10 years, from the lowest snowfall on record, or the lowest snow on the ground on record, to the highest. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So the next thing we're looking at is how ice wedge polygons have changed over time, and we've set up a series of study sites in the Trail Valley Creek area to look at changes in ice wedge polygons and how that can affect lake drainage. And we've been doing work on snow cover at very fine resolution and seeing how that affects ground temperatures and ice wedge cracking, for example. And then that work is continuing to look at methods to model changes in ice wedges over time, in the past, but over the last 50 years and into the future as well. And the last, I'd like to just mention that one of the sort of uncertainties and one of the unexpected changes was the increasing number of beavers throughout this area over about the last 15 years. So we've shown that beaver dams can, of course, greatly increase water levels in these lakes, similar to what you would find during rainfall events in the summer on these lakes as well. So it's likely that increases in beaver populations and building of dams and lake outlets is resulting in increased drainage of these lakes. So what are the next steps? We're going to be integrating and applying a series of models listed here, and surface water and ocean topography satellite data, and considering how these lakes are going to change into the future. What is the future over the next few decades? And as David nicely showed, we have to be thinking over the next centuries. If I had to guess, it seems very unlikely that thermokarst lakes will remain a feature on this landscape with huge impacts on the ecosystems. And I think the more important questions are things like, how quickly will these lakes be removed from the landscape? What portion of lakes will be removed into the future? Are these lakes viable at a global temperature increase of 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C? And what are the impacts on communities and the policy implications related to the ongoing changes? And I'll just stop there. And thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Phil. That was really interesting. Our next speaker is Dr. Chris Spence, research scientist at the National Hydrology Research Centre at Environment and Climate Change Canada in Saskatoon. So go ahead, Chris, you can share your screen.
Thanks, Lisa. Everybody can see that okay, I hope?
Yeah, it looks good.
Yep, thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm really just a representative of a larger group of people that have been working on a study the last several years, looking at the influence of land cover change around the Yellowknife area. So there have been lots of documented instances of climate warming and permafrost loss induced land cover change across the southern Arctic. Phil was just speaking about some, but in the mountainous areas as well as the Taiga Plains. Not as much had been done recently, sort of in the Taiga Shield until recently, when Anna Snyder and recently showed that tree infilling is the sort of the predominant land cover change that algae shield in the last half century. These are some images, a paper of hers. There's a peatland, an air photo from 1972, which shows almost no trees in it, versus some satellite imagery from 2017, where you can see certainly some trees encroaching on that space. So this change in canopy density in subarctic shield begs several questions. If we're going to have more trees on the landscape or denser forests, what does that mean for energy partitioning? In terms of how energy is partitioned versus heating the air or evaporating the water. What does it mean for how vegetation uses water? And following from that, what does that mean for the water in the soils as these canopies densify? And also, does this densification actually create measurable changes in the evapotranspiration rate at the catchment scale? There have been several studies that have shown that there are differences between sparse canopies and dense canopies, or wetland canopies and forest canopies. But does it really make a difference at once you scale up to the catchment scale? Because you've got a diversity of land cover types and in the mosaic that is the Tega shield between wetlands, bedrocks, and lakes and ponds. And so we also wanted to look at sort of the larger scale. And where we did this at the Baker Creek Research Catchment, which is a roughly 150 square kilometer watershed that drains the Yellowknife Bay and Great Slave Lake. I do want to acknowledge and mention that this is geographically part of Treaty 11 and dry geese territory, and part of the traditional lands of the Yellowknife Stene, the Cleach-Old and North Slave Métis. And it's a pleasure to work there. The catchment is located just north of Yellowknife and Didino and Detta. From the maps, you can see it's dominated by lakes. There's 350 lakes in the watershed, and terrestrially, it's dominated by exposed bedrock, actually, with patches of coniferous forest, peatlands, and peat-filled depressions, and shrubby wetlands. So how we tried to get at these questions, we used a number of different techniques, and over three study years, from 2018, which was the wettest, 2019, which was the driest, and 2020, which was kind of in between the two. And we looked at those growing seasons in those 3 years. We set up eddy covariance towers over a sparse canopy and a dense canopy to estimate the energy partitioning. We sampled precipitation, stream flow, vegetation, and soil for the stable isotopes of water, and also measured soil state as time domain reflectometry sensors. That's I think a really good picture of one of the installations, down maybe a half meter or so, depending on how far we can get, depending on the frost table. In terms of the results, what we found was that basically dense canopies evaporate more than sparse canopies, denoted very sort of like those orange lines versus the purpley lines. And what we also found was that the dense canopies are more influenced by radiative factors like the incoming radiation from the sun, the heat from the air, or air temperatures than the sparse canopies, which are a little more influenced by things like wind and how dry the air is. And that's kind of denoted on the right-hand side by that omega term, which really just explains how those two terms, the radiative and sort of aerodynamic terms, are control things. And because the dense canopies are more controlled by radiative terms, which is more consistent from year to year, you end up getting, with more trees, a more consistent evapotranspiration rate, both through the growing season, as it varies from sort of wet conditions to dry conditions, while the sparse canopy has much more variation from year to year. So the source of that evapotranspiration we got from the isotopic signatures. I'll just pause here for a second and say sometimes my head can really swim with some of the isotope data. So I'm just there's a lot of dots on this figure, and I'm just gonna try to focus on a few things that are the big takeaways. Some of the people who know more about isotopes than I do maybe can figure out the details, but the big things from this, if you look at the figure on the left, it shows the isotopic signatures in sort of snow, which is gray, or the rain, which is blue, compared to the vegetation species. And it shows that the water in the plants is more like rain than it is snow. So that's where they source their water from. And the image on the two graphs on the right, the LCXS, what we use that for is determine how old the water is, in the sense that as water becomes evaporatively enriched, or it becomes enriched with the heavier isotopes due to evaporation, this LCXS value becomes larger and more negative. So you can see in the graph to the far right that there is a variation in the age of the water that's in the plants, such that they tend to use, say, I don't know if you can see my pointer, sort of older water at the beginning of the season, which is probably last year's water, more recent water in the middle of the season, and then sometimes some older water, which is not the same older water in the spring. It's just probably older water that fell earlier that summer. And you sort of get the same sort of pattern every year. And this is also really telling here in that when there's less rain and it's drier, the plants tend to use this older water. But when it's wet enough, they become opportunistic and they just grab whatever new water they can have. And that's what you can glean from this sort of non-linear relationship. So when it's wet, they use new water. When it's dry, they have to resort to using the older stuff. And what's left in the water is really important. In this middle panel, there's sort of the 3 different years, and you can see how much older the water is in 2019 in that dry year, and that's denoted by these dark green colors. And it's kind of hard to tell, but when you compare the dense and the sparse, the dense panels are a little more green than they are yellow, which implies by the end of the season, you end up with older water in the ground underneath a denser canopy, because the trees there are more consistently pulling the water out, and it's the newer water that they're after. So when you try to upscale this to the whole catchment, it's actually, it's like there's not much to see here, because there aren't really substantial differences too much between how much a sparse canopy evaporates and the dense canopy evaporates, but the differences aren't large enough. When you upscale that to the Taiga Shield landscape, which is dominated by the lakes and the bedrock anyway, you don't get that much of a change. So if you run a scenario where you look at the land cover changes on undetected, which is, replacing some of the sparse canopies with dense canopies, and movement of about like 5% of the bedrock is now a sparse canopy, the evapotranspiration really only increased about 10%. And it's only until you get into some really crazy infilling scenarios where you start to see a large, a measurable change in the evapotranspiration, which is something I'd call around the 20% mark. So you'd have to replace all the sparse canopies with dense canopies and put sparse canopies on a quarter of the bedrock in order to change the catchment scale of evapotranspiration. So to sum up, a denser canopy on the subarctic Canadian Shield generally had higher evapotranspiration rates, which was really controlled by incoming radiation. What we noted was that both over and understory species tend to access the same water sources, which were sort of shallow, new, and they were very opportunistic in that water use. And what that meant is that the water that was remaining in the ground, especially under dense canopies, happened to be older and had longer residence times. But at the catchment scale, there's not as much of an impact as you might think, which is different than, say, with Tega Plains. So it's interesting that the differences between the two landscapes, and it really speaks to sort of maybe how important geology is to how these landscapes will respond to climate warming, induced land cover change. And I'll stop there.
And then our final speaker is Louise Mercer, PhD student in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Northumbria University in Newcastle. So go ahead, Louise.
Okay, hi everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for having me. And I also want to say thank you to Devalyn Pokiat. I can't do this without her. She is my community partner. She is a mother, a subsistence harvester, and community liaison for the hamlet of Tuktiaktuk. And today I'm just going to present our approach and how we developed an initial pilot study that fed into a larger community-based monitoring program that is led by DEVA. So community-based monitoring is a really good method for collecting valuable baseline information, but also supporting inclusive research processes that can help to support Indigenous governance and self-determination in research. There's no one-size-fits-all approach when we think of community-based monitoring, but the approach I try to take is supporting engagement in every step of the research process, from decision-making to from data collection to decision-making. So I work with DEVA in Tuktiaktuk in the Nubialwit settlement region, and we saw a couple of the presentations today touch upon this area. And I'm just going to give an overview of my approach and run you through it from question development to the outcomes. So my research approach started with defining the questions, but to do that, I spent a lot of time in Tuk. So I went out there for a couple of months in 2022, and the real goal was to build relationships. I didn't have any questions developed. It was really just to become a face in the community. And this entailed spending time at community events, being invited to fishing, and becoming part of families as well, which I was really welcomed into, and I'm very grateful for that. And I also spent time with the pre-existing community-based monitoring program that helped me identify challenges and opportunities associated with community-based monitoring. It also gave me a lot of time to support training with DEVA. This was only enabled because DEVA is a salaried position with the Canada Inuit Nunavut UK Arctic Research Programme NUNA. And I think this was really valuable. We didn't just do data collection or field skills. We also looked at other aspects of the research process that's not normally touched upon in community-based monitoring approaches. So data collation when you get in from the field, but also data management, and that requires a large time investment. But then it also enabled me to identify a community priority of contaminants from legacy infrastructure source areas. So I was there all summer, and this was a issue that was continuously raised, among other things, but together we decided to develop an initial pilot study to address this community priority. So now I'm going to talk a bit about how we went about developing an appropriate method for data collection. So we developed a study that was accessible and applicable. So as you can see, all the sites, we collected 10 water sampling sites, and all the sites were accessible within an hour of the hamlet. So we were able to go around all sites within an hour. It meant that we didn't take time out of DEVA's caring responsibilities. We also were still developing a study, so we still have sites that look at different variables, so industry source areas, transport source areas, and waste areas. But I think the whole point of this development of this process was just developing a study that was accessible. It didn't take hours to reach, and it really enabled us to visit the sites repeatedly and enabled us to identify responsive sampling. So we went out before and after storm events, because that's another thing that we're seeing more and more frequently in Tuck. And then I'll just talk a bit about the analysis. And so we did show that there was an impact of storms on heavy metal release, mainly from industry source areas. So as I mentioned, we went out before and after the storm. So as you can see on the graph, after the storm, there was a spike in zinc from industry source areas. This wasn't a harmful effect. I think the whole point was just showing that community-based monitoring can be used to capture this trend in temporal release of contaminants. And we also got a bit creative, and Diva really wanted to get involved in lab work, and this is usually not available to do in northern communities unless you're at research stations. So we developed a little filtering setup, which might seem small, but it's even just another way to contribute to the research process beyond data collection. Now I'll talk a bit about our co-dissemination approach of the results. So we presented our results together in a variety of different means. We presented back at the Hunters and Trappers Committee. We also presented back to the council. We travelled to Toronto together to present at the ArcticNet Annual Scientific Meeting in 2022. We presented at other conferences as well, but this was a key time that we presented together, because at this conference we were approached by the Northern Contaminants Programme, who suggested that we apply to one of their community-based monitoring and research grants. So we decided to apply for it, and that involved us writing a proposal together. It enabled Diva to be the PI of the project, because it didn't require a PhD. So often funding requires you to have a PhD to be a PI, but in this case, it's an accessible funding program looking to support more community-based approaches. So we wrote Diva in as the PI, and we also enabled, as we were writing the grant together, we were enabled to address priorities, but also priorities that Diva had for self-development and youth engagement. And that was a really important aspect of the writing process as well. And just going to touch upon one of the biggest outcomes of our research so far is that we were awarded the grant together. So that's supporting a 3-year Indigenous-led community-based monitoring programme. And it looks at the temporal and spatial trends of mercury release and microplastics from different source areas, such as coastal erosion, legacy infrastructure, and also river inputs from the Mackenzie Delta. But we often talk about the science, and I'm today talking about the partnership development process. And one of the biggest outcomes and goals is just to support youth engagement in the research. So we had Lena Rose join us for training last summer and initial sample collection. Diva's now also enrolled in Indigenous Environmental Leadership Pathways Programme, which is a higher education course, because she wants to develop the transferable skills and to take her education to a higher level. So I've been really grateful to just support in that process whenever I can. But also over time, the process has become more autonomous. So earlier you saw us presenting together, and recently Diva and Dina Rose went and presented in Ottawa at the Northern Contaminants Programme workshop together. Without me, without any support, external support. And this was just, I think this is just a really nice full circle moment. So I'm still supporting, but from afar, and it's been really nice to see. If you are interested, we have produced some papers from the work we have done so far that are available open access online. And yeah, that's it. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time you've taken to listen. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. It's very inspiring. We now have time for questions. Speakers, if you want to turn on your videos, we have a number of questions from Richard. So the first question was for Dave in reference to the infrared cameras. Do you allow for the time of day for solar warming effects versus the nighttime zero solar absorption?
So great question. And there certainly are better times of the day and better times of the year to use an infrared camera. So one is always looking for the biggest contrast you can get. So the flying over the ground surface when the surface water is warm and so late afternoon and the groundwater is extremely cold, obviously maintaining its temperature. So the video I showed you there, surface water, so almost all shallow, was probably 15 degrees Celsius. This was late August, and the groundwater was maybe 3 degrees Celsius, so big exchange. So really good point. Important time has to be when there's a contrast you can see. Otherwise, you can't see it. It's all one infrared response.
Okay, and another question for you. Without one or two boreholes, is it possible to say what is bedrock or sediment or ancient channels?
Oh, yeah. So I didn't get into it enough, but that area has been the site of very extensive petroleum exploration for literally decades, and lots of seismic lines with seismic shot hole data. So we certainly had access to the geology that was put together by the oil companies and by the Geological Survey of Northwest Territories. So in a sense, probably the subsurface, the deeper subsurface, the rock, is probably better known than the nearer surface material is. So there were lots of boreholes around. We couldn't afford to drill any new ones. We had to use only portable handheld shallow installations for groundwater sampling. But reasonable information there on the geology. And of course, that part of the central Mackenzie Valley is a large syncline, and that deep blue area I showed you on that airborne geophysical signal follows right down the center of the syncline, probably along some faults and joints that are active there. Anyway, so there was some information in the subsurface.
Another question for you, Dave. Is there additional research into thawing system and increasing frequency of thaw due to solute release?
So that's a really insightful question too. As solutes increase in water, of course, the freezing point goes down. So in many areas where freezing and thawing is occurring, pore water gets isolated as higher concentration. It takes a lot more decrease in temperature to freeze it. So the models will accommodate that. Tends to be more in the active zone than in freeze thaw in other types of settings. But in terms of the buildup of solutes from being released from permafrost, the concentrations are relatively low, so the impact isn't as significant. It's probably the heat circulation that is more significant as the flow systems open up and the italics allow groundwater to circulate more. But really good question on solute concentration.
Thanks, Dave. The next question is for Phil. How does vegetation growth affect things? I understand the north slope is massively increasing bush growth versus classic grassy tundra.
Yeah. So good question. And I didn't talk about that much, but we've been studying it for a while. So shrub growth has increased a lot in the area. Probably not a lot of new shrub patches, but extending of the size of the area covered by the shrubs and the height of the shrubs. And they affect all aspects related to lakes for sure. They impact evapotranspiration, snow accumulation, snowmelt runoff to the lakes, and many other, all aspects, I guess. And you get a lot of shrubs developing along the edges of lakes where they then accumulate a lot of snow over the winter. So that affects ground temperatures a lot and probably is impacting in unknown ways thawing of the bed or the shoreline of the lakes and then drainage of the lakes through that mechanism.
Thanks, Phil. The next question is for Chris. Does tree growth preserve active layer depth due to solar shading? And by implication, preserving permafrost? Some additional information from this person is that they learned from a researcher into salmon research that rivers subject to tree shading has a massive impact on water temperature and salmon health.
It can. There's a lot of sort of positive and negative feedbacks when it comes to having, sort of, I guess, trees and their impact on ground temperature. Sometimes, so yes, it reduces the amount of solar radiation that hits the surface. But trees also intercept a lot of snow, which means that you get shallower snowpacks underneath trees than you do open areas, which removes that insulation. So you can sometimes get, I guess that's maybe, I'm sorry, maybe I'm talking in circles here. Less snow, less insulation and colder temperatures underneath the trees than in an open area. But so there is plenty of research that's kind of dealt with that. Phil's done some of the stuff on shrubs and their influences, similar to trees. So it can be really hard to figure out exactly what the impact is on a tree versus not having a tree.
Another question for you, Chris. If the forests use up the rainfall, would that mean there is no lake or river recharge, so lower flows? And does higher ET not mean cooler summer temperatures? But also,
Yeah.
if the trees have lower albedo, does that trump ET?
I think I'll answer the last two questions first, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yes, higher evapotranspiration should mean cooler summer temperatures. But they do have a lower albedo. What happens though in landscapes like the Canadian Shield that are patchy enough, the atmosphere tends to become well mixed enough that no individual patch has a strong enough influence on sort of the regional climate. It all gets very well mixed, whether it's the forested areas, the bedrock or the lakes, which I think Phil touched on in his talk about the impact that they have on regional climate. As for the forests using up all the rainfall, and what does that mean for stream flow? Jen Balzer and I have talked about this at length, and I think it depends on how much rain is coming out of the sky, because if you do have more trees on the landscape that have more consistent evapotranspiration, then during dry conditions, if those trees are still sucking up the same amount of water and sending evapotranspiration up into the sky, then that does mean that there's less, in theory, downstream. So more trees might make dry years drier, if that makes any sense, like more stream flow drought. But when it gets wet, there might just be enough rain that there's loads of water for everything. And the trees will only evapotranspire at that sort of similar rate, which means that you'll get lots more left over for stream flow. So it kind of depends on if it's dry or if it's wet. It also depends on when that rain falls. A lot of rain that falls tends to get because it's a dry climate anyway, and monthly evapotranspiration rates can exceed precipitation. And this is quite common, so that, yes, most of the water that falls in the summer never reaches the stream. It just gets put into storage or evapotranspired back up.
Great.
Sorry, that's a long answer.
Thanks, guys. To go to a high flow question, this is our last question for anyone who would like to answer. Has anyone knowledge of Rivière La Marche near Wati and trends occurring? This person's read that they're experiencing they've read that the flow volume has doubled, yet they are experiencing a severe drought in this area. Is this related to permafrost, and what can be expected for long-term trends? Any takers for that one?
I can take that.
Great.
If Phil and Dave don't want it, I'll give her a go.
Yeah, up to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Nobody really knows for sure, but it is part of a longer, sort of a more widespread trend across the territories, especially when it comes to winter flows. Just those, there are some theories about permafrost thaw and opening conduits, similar to what Dave was talking about. And some of those diagrams he had in his talk, but there's no smoking gun yet.
Just add quickly to that. It really good question, because people are in the Yukon, just connecting with a colleague, Brendan Mulligan, in Yukon about this, and they've seen increase in stream flow, and anticipating. It's not so much the volume of water being released from permafrost. That's a slow, small circulating amount, but it's the interconnection between the groundwater systems that are changing and causing these systems to change. So it could be locally more water getting into the system, as Chris mentions, because these subsurfaces opening up more and allowing more circulation to occur.
Great, thanks, Steve. And Phil, you have one more
Can I
thing?
just quickly jump in on that? Because this is a really interesting point, in that even though we might think that changes in stream flow are pretty simple, or should be pretty simple in response to changing climate, it actually gets incredibly complex, as both Chris and Dave has suggested. It's way more difficult than we all might think it is, actually, and more complex. And I just have one example to give. I had a postdoc, John Shee, who was looking at changes, in this case, snowmelt runoff at the Trail Valley Creek site. And he showed, as you might expect, that snowmelt is occurring earlier in time in the spring. It's getting warmer, you would expect that to happen. But he then found, looking at the Water Survey of Canada data, that stream flow runoff was actually occurring later and later into the spring. So we had this strange conundrum of earlier spring, start of spring melt, but later actual stream flow runoff. And at first you would go, that's nonsensical, it can't be possible. And then the more you think about it, start thinking about changes in permafrost, changes in shrub cover, and changes in snow cover around the watershed, and how that impacts active layer thickness, for example, and then runoff. And you can start to think of ways you could arm wave a bit and say, I can imagine how all of the changes combined are resulting in later stream flow. But I don't think we know the answer to many of these types of questions.
Thanks, Phil. And thanks to everyone. Richard said that more vegetation would hold back more water discharge, or just water discharge. So yes, that's all the questions from the chat. I just wanted to say thank you for everyone joining today, and thank you to all of our great presentations. We hope to see you all in April for our last webinar as part of this series, and it will focus on food security and community well-being in the North. So thanks again, everyone.